Benning Wentworth, as we know, started issuing patents, grants by the dozen, and there were people in New York doing the same thing. And in the next 15 years, between 1760, when the French and Indian War ended, and 1775, when the American Revolution began, are years of great interest to anybody who loves their Vermont history, and especially if you're down in this neck of the woods. I grew up in Bennington, as I told you, and grew up with these stories. Our speaker today is going to talk about settlements and those clashes in those 15 years. I first met Bob Hoar a couple of years ago. Bob is also from North Bennington and was conducting and still does conduct some tours of that area toward the Breckenridge farm where the standoff was, and the other areas, other sites along there, Seth Warner's home, and where John Stark camped before the Battle of Bennington. Those are all within walking distance. Bob is a real student of Vermont history, especially of that period and of that area. He has worked at the Bennington battlefield and also has been actively involved with the Bennington Museum down there. I got to know him quite well as part of that Breckenridge event that we talked about earlier. We asked him if he would give us a presentation about his findings, and he focused it on this area. So Bob is a great historian. I know you're going to be interested in his research and his presentation. So without further ado, Bob Hoar, come on up here and welcome.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so we're here to talk about Ethan Allen, the Green Mountain Boys, and Scottish settlers in early Vermont. Sometimes I go by the Iron Canyon Club. Okay. So here's a painting by Thomas Davies. It's of the falls at Otter Creek, and you'll notice a sawmill there. These are the falls at Virgins, and we're going to talk a little bit about some Scottish settlers in this location there. Once again, did anybody not get a brochure here? Brochures, pass them around. So this is the little brochure that I made as a handout for today's presentation. And this is the brochure that I made for this summer's Breckenridge Standoff. And once again, thanks everybody for coming to the and helping with the birthplace of Vermont event this summer. Okay, so I'm going to tell a story about Scottish settlers, and it's sort of broken up into two related stories. So we have a part one here. And the part one is it's about Rupert and Paulett, and I kind of call it the White Creek Meadows confrontations because it was referred to sometimes as the White Creek Meadows. So here I've sort of recreated the reward. We're going to start out with this, with the reward poster that Ethan Allen made for the New York Assemblyman. So what we're talking about is some murky history and some of the black eyes that Vermont history has, that the Green Mountain Boys have, that Ethan Allen have, with certain historians concerning our history here. And some of these stories that I'm telling you today really are some pretty skinny stories with just a few primary sources. So we're going to get into something that's kind of right into the mists of time at this point. So after these confrontations that I'm about to explain, New York offered some rewards for the Green Mountain Boys. You know, remember Baker and Robert Cochran and Ethan Allen? They offered 20 pounds each for the rest of these men. And Ethan Allen would offer a reward for the New York Assemblymen in return. So, whereas James Duane and John Kemp of New York have by their menaces and threats greatly disturbed the public peace and repose of the honest peasants of Bennington and to the northward, which are now and ever have been in the peace of God and King, and are patriotic and lead subjects of George III, any person that will apprehend these common disturbers, James Duane and John Kemp, and bring them to landlord Fays in Bennington, shall have 15 pounds for James Duane, and shall have 10 pounds reward for John Kemp. And that's dated Poultney, February 5th, 1772. So, offering lower rewards than the $20 pounds price for each of their captures, Allen and his lieutenants were mocking the New York officials as worth less than a Vermonter. Next slide. So this is really a historiography, kind of a rebuttal for some recent books. Quite a few books that come out and talk about the Green Mountain Boys and Ethan Allen, and are as patriotic as they should be. And they're taken from New York sources. Some of these New York sources are incorrect. And they were intended to be incorrect because we're talking about a land feud here. So there's nothing necessarily wrong with some of these sources being incorrect because they're just taking it from the primary sources. So let me talk about that No Turning Point book just for a second. The Green Mountain Boys, continuing violence. In the controversy over conflicting land titles and the grants, the case of Charles Hutchinson is typical. He had served in a corporal in Montgomery's Highland Regiment during the 7 Years' War and had seen the fertility of the land north of Albany. With the peace, Hutchinson settled in Hebron, New York, where he farmed his 200-acre New York grant. On October 29, 1771, he was one of the first victims of the violence that challenged New York's land titles. He built a log house and was working on the farm when 9 armed Green Mountain Boys seized him, burned his home, cursed New York's governor and council, cursed the king, and ordered him to get off his grant. Okay. So I'll be pushing back on some of these locations that they're talking about here. And I'm using Highland Hall as one of my sources, as well as the primary sources. And there's been some new mapping that's going to be behind some of this information that I'm coming up with here. The violence spreads. Another form of law, that of the mob, immediately assumed a dominant role on the grants. 2 months after the second set of trials, Ethan Allen and Robert Cochran escalated the resistance and returned to the area north of Albany, where Cochran had struck just before the most recent trials. This time they chased Scott farmer Charles Hutchinson, a former corporal in His Majesty's Highland Regiment, from his land. They demolished his cabin, telling him that they had determined that morning to offer a burnt offering to the gods of this world by burning the logs of that house. Here's a great book that's I used a little bit for this presentation, and it's about the Scottish settlers in colonial America, and it's talking about Lord Dunmore, who's one of the characters in this story that I'm talking about today. So in terms of, in general, Scottish settlers, there are some other people out there working on this. Here's our Green Mountain Boys flag. Next. And here is one of my favorite maps about illustrating the New York, Vermont, or New York, New England controversy, is a military map made by, you would think, the king and his military men after the ruling that gave New York jurisdiction to the Connecticut River. It would seem like that would be a military detail that would have been alerted to the military map maker here. So you can see Vermont, future Vermont, is clearly part of New England. So the Breckenridge Standoff is sort of where we're starting our story, and this is a story that comes after that. So we're still doing some background information here. Here's a picture of the Breckenridge Standoff, the birthplace of Vermont, and the ejectment trials of Albany, which caused the sheriff's posse to come to Bennington to evict some settlers here. And so the point is that this was really the last sheriff's posse to enter Vermont and evict settlers under New York rule. And things sort of would change or evolve from that, okay? So here's sort of a picture of the Catamount Tavern showing several Green Mountain Boys scenes in the background there. And what we're doing is we're transitioning from the sheriff's posses, the large sheriff's posses, to an era that we call sort of, some historians have named the Beach Seal era. So we're talking about surveyors, axemen, chainmen, and surveying, and a race to claim and survey northern Vermont is what's really going on here. Okay, so here's me getting into the nitty-gritty. So this is what we call the Souvier Map, and I got some help from Ted Rice, who's the White Creek town historian. He's the one who helped me put that line in there. Boy, was I struggling with putting that line in there, and I think that map may have been made to kind of confuse where that 20-mile line is, Vermont's border that they're trying to claim, was sort of a hard one to put on this map that was made by New York. And what we're looking at here is bounty lands, little claims that were given to Scottish soldiers in between Vermont and future Vermont and New York. So as a way to control settlement, soldiers' grants have been placed there, okay? And just as part of these details here, so we're talking about 1771, the king had sort of pushed back on the New York's egregious granting of lands in Vermont in 1767, passing a restraining decree. And many of these grants here actually were from 1771. So after the restraining decree was passed, you can see some of those, like Eugene and Chatham, are New York towns. Okay, so once again, we're talking about Rupert, which is sometimes referred to as White Creek Meadows. And it's really just all along Route 153. And I'm talking about still what they said happened, how the violence had spread, how we're talking about north of Albany, how some authors had referred to some fine houses being torn down by the Green Mountain Boys. And, once again, we're just talking about the border moving north. So after successful border resistance in the Bennington and Shasbury areas, they're defending the border just a little bit further north. Okay? And one more thing about Ethan Allen and his militia. So the things that are being said about the Green Mountain Boys include forming the extra illegal militia of the New Hampshire grants was Allen's first act of open rebellion. No militia could be formed legally without the approval of the royal governor of a province. All officers had to receive written commissions from the royal governor, the king's personal representative. Yet, boy and man, from 14 to 70, now flocked to join Allen's new militia. So, I guess I would editorialize that that's both good and bad treatment of the Green Mountain Boys there. Thank you.
Excuse me. That last slide, what were the X's?
Yeah, I fixed my map here because I'm talking about the route of the Green Mountain Boys evicting 3 different people. I sort of changed my mind. I didn't fix the map for the presentation. And we're going to get back into that very same information.
I'm very familiar with the road structure down there, so I was just trying to wonder why that was what that happened.
Yeah, we'll get right. Thank you for that, and we'll get right back into this information in a second. So here's from the Rupert Historical Society. Sometimes the New Yorkers would try to get people who thought as they did to settle on the land they had bought. The town of Rupert had been granted by the governor of New Hampshire in 1761. Settlements were made a few years later. In 1771, the governor of New York granted or sold a part of this same land, which was owned by Robert Cochran. The people who obtained the grant tried to have their land settled by their friends, but their men were driven off and their log houses pulled down and burned. So once again, we're talking about one of our people is John Tabor Kemp, whose claims were in Hebron. Battle of Culloden. Okay, so John Reid is going to be one of our major, he's really our protagonist in this story. So John Reid was very important at the Battle of Culloden. there was actually a ship with money for the Jacobites that was captured by the British Army just before the Battle of Culloden, sort of forcing the Jacobites to fight that day. And that ship was actually captured by John Reid. And he captured that ship sort of on his own initiative. So it's a little bit of a long story there. But John Reid, he's kind of a badass, okay? Just to put it frankly. So Jacobite culture. After the Battle of Culloden, don't pretend to be an expert here, but you're going to have quite a few of the Jacobites coming to America, okay? And this was in 1746, so settling the New World. But the irony is that the British soldiers, who included many Scottish regiments, would also be coming to America for the French and Indian War. So to be clear, the people that I'm going to be talking to mostly about today, the Scottish soldiers, are the Scottish soldiers fighting with the Redcoats, the British Army, not the Jacobite Scottish soldiers. So, once again, we're talking about settlement along the Vermont-New York border. That has a lot to do with the proclamation of 1763, where the king is trying to restrict white settlement along this line. Maybe you guys have seen this map before. You can see how it goes right through Vermont there. And to create an Indian homeland. So it's after the French and Indian War, and sort of more specifically after Pontiac's War, and to appease the Indians. The Indians probably thought that they were being looked out for by this proclamation line of 1763. But it includes those bounty grants that we're talking about. And really, in effect, the proclamation of 1763 is restricting New England settlement to the west. Okay, Major John Small. So what we're doing is we're getting into the nitty-gritty of who these Scottish settlers were behind all these grants in Vermont. And Major John Small figures very prominently in the Breckenridge Standoff, in the birthplace of Vermont, down in Shaftesbury. So we're not really talking about Major John Small. But Major John Small was creating the 84th Regiment of Royal Highland immigrants out of the former North British Fusiliers in the Black Watch, who fought in the French Indian War, fought in the unsuccessful attack at Ticonderoga with Abercrombie. And he's going to be, turns out he's related to John Reid. So this is one of the fantastic discoveries that I've made here. Turns out that they were cousins. And we'll get a little bit more into that. So Major John Small is actually a pretty important guy. So here's one of Joseph Trumbull's paintings, and it's the death of Joseph Warren at Bunker Hill. And that's John Small right there, stopping a grenadier from killing Joseph Warren, who was killed at the battle. But it shows the conflicts that people were having in the Revolutionary War as it began. And once again, that's just a flag of his Royal Highland immigrants who, so we're talking about Scottish soldiers settling on the border between Vermont and New York. They actually will settle in Nova Scotia. So you might say that the threat of a Scottish colony threat was real. So the plan would take root in Nova Scotia eventually. So back to our Connecticut River border controversy. So here's a map showing the Benning Wentworth grants in yellow. And it says right here, the Connecticut River is fixed by His Majesty in Council to be between New York and at the Connecticut River. You can see Paul and Rupert right there. So really for me, the New York claims were a reaction to Benning Wentworth's granting of the 130 towns, and what a recent author that I've been working with has called the creation of an ancient border. Okay, so the only visible reminder of this confrontation that I'm finally going to get to, that I call the White Creek Meadows confrontation, is this sign. It's on Route 153 in Rupert. It's the Robert Cochran sign, condemned to death by the New York Assembly. So there was one event that happened right before the White Creek Meadows events that gets conflated with those events, okay? Governor Tryon to Justices Skeen and Monroe, the enclosed copy of a petition lately preferred to me will inform you of a riot and breach of the peace committed on the 11th of June near Argyle town by one Cochran and 14 armed men in violently assaulting and dispossessing Donald McIntyre and the other complainants of lands granted to them by the government and then under their actual improvement. Well, once again, it turns out that Donald McIntyre's lands are Rupert, okay? Okay, so we're finally getting right down to this stuff here. So what actually happened? So we're talking about the White Creek Meadows controversies, and we're going to go right into Highland Hall to get his words on this for us. As early as June 1771, efforts appear to have been made by claimants under military grants to occupy some lands in the western part of Rupert, but the intruders were attacked by a large party under Robert Cochran, who claimed lands under a New Hampshire title. Other attempts to make settlements in Rupert and Pollock were made under New York claims in October. It seems that two brothers of the name of Todd, claiming under a New York patent to one Lieutenant Farrant, had commenced work on a lot near the west line of Rupert, which was claimed by Robert Cochran under the New Hampshire Charter, and which, it is said, he'd partly cleared. That another New York claimant of the name of Hutchison had begun to build a log house on another lot belonging to a New Hampshire grantee, the logs being laid and the rafters fixed for a roof. And that further to the northward, one Reid had begun an improvement on a piece of land in Pollock and had erected there a shelter, having 4 crotches driven into the ground with boughs for a covering, boughs, I guess. Cochran, with a party of 7 armed men from Rupert, accompanied by Ethan Allen and Member Baker, went to the Todds, drove them from their work, declaring they would never suffer a man to be seated there who held a New York title. The party then went to Hutchinson's place, took down the logs and rafters of his house, placing them in piles, and burned them with fire. The house or shelter of Reid was afterwards destroyed in the same manner, all the claimants being required to part immediately from the lands granted by New Hampshire and threatened with barbarous usage if they returned. So the...
Sorry, no one was hurt in those?
What's that?
No one was hurt?
Nobody was ever hurt in any of these confrontations besides the implied whippings that were happening in most of these confrontations. So I guess the answer is yes, but no casualties or fatalities. So now we're up to somewhere near Indian Hill in Pollock, which was perhaps a site of a French and Indian war skirmish, is where I've sort of figured out where John Reid's shelter was. Next slide, please. So Colonel John Reid. So this is going to be the same John Reid that we're going to talk about in part 2. Okay. So here's a very important New York claimant who is another Scottish soldier. And it is said by one of the books that the Hutchinsons and 8 other families evicted fled to Salem. Okay? Alexander McNaughton of Argyle issued a warrant for Allen's arrest and delivered it to Constable John Reid, ordering him to raise a posse and proceed to Rupert and arrest the culprits, but Reid failed to put the posse together. Then we have the story of the Tryon's reward for the Ethan Allens that I talked about before, as a result of what they had just done. Then we have the story of one more, because I said before there was no more posses, sheriff's posses, that were sent to Vermont after the Breckenridge affair. There may have been one more. So Tenek came to arrest some of these men that we know what we're talking about, and had the inability to find any of them. He stopped at Indian River and was treated roughly by one Harmon. So he had a completely unsuccessful attempt at collecting some of that rewards. So then the next thing that's going to happen is our Remember Baker story down in Sunderland. So John Monroe, trying to collect that 20-pound reward for the arrest of these men, is going to end up capturing Remember Baker, cutting off his thumb, but then the Green Mountain Boys will recapture Baker before they take him to Albany. Next slide. Okay, so we've made it to part 2. Okay, so I just introduced John Reid a little bit. So John Reid has a settlement around Middlebury, New Haven, and Virgins, or Panton. And he's just often confused with being one of those soldiers, or having one of those soldiers' grants. Well, he's actually eligible for a soldier's grant, but that's not actually what he had. He had a civil grant, and what he actually had was a dowry. So he was related. He married the daughter of Lord Stirling, who was a surveyor in New York and New Jersey, and his dowry included a lot of land in Vermont, and he added more land to it. Basically, he's buying some of the smaller soldiers' grants, and he accumulates 50,000 acres. 50,000 acres is more than roughly 2 ordinary Vermont townships. So here's the Souvier Map that's going to take us through this next part here. There's not as much controversy with this next part as there was with the first part. I was trying to correct some stuff there. So here's Major John Small. I'm talking about some of our important Scottish men. He's helped to build the Crown Point Road, as we all know here. And I also want to point out David Worcester, because I'm going to talk about him a little bit more. Once again, here's Crown Point. And over here is John Reid's settlement along Middlebury and Otter Creek. And there's just a little picture that I liked. The outside corner of Old Fort Amherst. So Fort Amherst and Fort Crown Point, one and the same. So here's just another little map. I like these maps of the New York grants. So Vermont claimed 130 towns in Vermont. And then New York started claiming the land and creating contrasting grants, contrasting town lines. Not the same town lines, but different town lines. And here's an interesting one because it shows New York's claims, and their map is not all filled in. And it's a race to claim northern Vermont. So surveying and mapping northern Vermont is really the game that's being played. And to me, I'm seeing this, and I'm thinking they're losing the race because Vermont's claimed and surveyed a lot more towns than they have. Okay, next slide, please. All right, so we're getting back to the Thomas Davies painting of the Padmorn sawmill, 1766 at Virgins Falls. Thomas Davies did a lot of paintings of forts and sites in North America, military sites, things like that. And I believe that's the location today, and there's a panel in Virgins near this site, and that's actually where I stole that particular version of Thomas Davies painting. So I'm not sure how much you guys are understanding any of these maps I'm throwing out here. So here's just a little simpler one, the Crown Point Road and Reid's settlement up above. And Reid had been involved in some settlements down here. That was the part 1 of my talk. Okay, so we're getting closer to talking about these confrontations here. So we're just talking about some sawmills and some blockhouses that were put in by Geoffrey Amherst. When they built Fort Crown Point, there was 3 blockhouses and 3 sawmills along Otter Creek. And they probably were part of, the materials for building the fort and the roads that were necessary, not only to get to Fort Crown Point, but there's a few other little side roads. I'm sure you guys know.
Benzel was an officer.
Yeah, you guys know a lot more about this than I do. Yes, he's a military engineer, is Benzel. Yep. Next. Okay, so here's Lake Dunmore. I told you we'd talk about Lord Dunmore and Dunmore's claims again. See, he's claiming Lake Dunmore, and he has this fictitious company called McClure and Company. Our people had a notice of Mr. Cockburn's intrusion, so there was a surveyor up on the Winooski River. Rallied a small party and pursued and overtook him and his party, and in their pursuit passed the towns of Panton and New Haven near the mouth of Otter Creek, dispossessed Colonel Reid of a sawmill in said Panton, and which by force and without color or even pretense of law he had taken from the original owners and builders. For more than 3 years before, and did at the same time extend his force, terrors, and threats into the town of New Haven, who by the vicious and haughty aid of Mr. Benzel, the famed engineer, with a number of assistants under their command, so terrified the inhabitants, which were about 12 in number, that they left their possessions and farms to the conquerors and escaped with the skin of their teeth. Just sort of expanding that same map so you can see Reid's settlement up here with Mr. Benzel. So John Reid was good friends with Lord Dunmore and may have been on some level an agent for his land claims. We'll talk about Dunmore a little bit more in the future. Of course, he would have been friendly to any of his New York or Scottish settlers' land claims, but would have had an extra interest in a friend of his, Lord Dunmore, who was probably behind some of the grants that he received as well. So around this time, there were some more blockhouses built by the Green Mountain Boys in New Haven and Meadows. So we're talking about an era of settlement and some competing blockhouses. Next. Oh, let's go back to that last slide. Where was I here? In the month of June 1773, Colonel Reid engaged several Scottish emigrants, then recently arrived at New York, to occupy as his tenants the lands of which he had been dispossessed the previous autumn, and he went with them to Otter Creek. On entering the lands, they found several persons settled on them, claiming under the New Hampshire charters. These Colonel Reid compelled by threats to leave, making, however, as he claimed, compensation for the growing crop of one of the principal occupants. He caused the grist mill to be repaired and several log huts to be erected, and then returned to New York. It appears from the affidavit of one of the tenants that they were informed on their way to Otter Creek that the title to the land was in dispute and desired to return to New York. But the colonel assured them that there was no question about the title, and he would put them in position to protect them there. The second invasion of the territory by Colonel Reid called out the Green Mountain Boys in considerable force. On the 11th of August, Allen, Warner, and Baker appeared on the ground with over 100 armed men, informed the Scotchmen that they had been imposed upon by Colonel Reid, and that the land did not belong to them, and warned them to depart. A short time was given them to remove their effects, when the huts were set on fire and burnt to the ground. And then they were very careful not to destroy the mills there. Okay, so some authors talked about the Green Mountain Boys destroying those mills over and over. Okay. When asked for his commission for doing the work he was then about, remember Baker held up his thumb, which had been cut off in the encounter with Justice Monroe at Arlington, saying that this was his commission. David Wooster, I showed you that map before, in Addison, okay? So a number of the Green Mountain Boys who were from the adjoining town of Addison. So David Wooster, who had been a captain in the French and Indian War and subsequently obtained a New York patent for 3,000 acres within that township, but had found it occupied by the settlers under New Hampshire charter, who refused to remove or acknowledge his title. On the return home of the Addison men, 13 in number, from the expedition against Colonel Reid's tenants, they found Captain Wooster with his sheriff serving writs of ejectment on those who were on the land which he claimed. Their indignation rose to the highest pitch that while they had been driving off the Yorkers for their neighbors, their own homes had been invaded. They finally took him and the sheriff and tied them to a tree and threatened to give them the beach shoe. Well, they didn't actually give David Wooster a beach seal, but he would have been the most famous person that the Green Mountain Boys would have potentially ever given the beach seal. So the result of this is going to be a higher reward for for Ethan Allen, it's going to go up to 100 pounds, and his associates. And this caused a request for troops by Governor Tryon. He's going to request redcoats march on Vermont after this encounter, and that's going to bring us the phrase, "a few lawless vagabonds." So Haldimand insulting Governor Tryon for requesting British redcoats to help him deal with a few lawless vagabonds. Okay, so New York's vast overreach and fraud was considered obnoxious by King George III. Governor Tryon and Colonel Reid would go to London. So Colonel Reid is recalled by the king, goes to London to talk about his egregious land claims. And while there, they decide not to press their claim. They get the hint that from the king that their land claims in Vermont were obnoxious. So really, effectively, this is the end of New York's land claims in Vermont. Is the meeting with the trip of Reid and Tryon to London.
What year was that, sorry?
1773.
70.
Yeah. So Governor Tryon would end up being very formidable. He would have Fort Tryon in the same location where Fort Washington was in New York City. And he was a militia general, and he's known for the raid on Danbury in 1777. Small gave his inheritance to Colonel Reid, because they were cousins and good friends. Reid gave all of his inheritance, $50,000, to found the Edinburgh College of Music, because his daughter had married a man without his consent. So Colonel Reid was actually a notable flute player and composer. So it's interesting that a lot of the efforts that these men went through to accumulate these fortunes actually has a home, as a music school in Scotland. Next. So, I promised you a little bit about Lord Dunmore. So before Governor Tryon was Governor Dunmore. When Lord Dunmore was governor of New York, he was claiming a lot of land and really liked the position that he was in and wanted to stay governor of New York. But it was already in the works that he was going to be the governor of Virginia, okay? So when Tryon shows up in New York City, he throws a fit. He spends a couple of days trying to get Tryon to trade governments with him, and Tryon refused, okay? So after this scene, little known, and there's almost no documentation of this, Lord Dunmore actually came to Vermont and visited Lake Dunmore for the first time. He pours wine into the lake and consecrates the lake in his forlorn hope of his vast empire in the north. Lord Dunmore would then go to Virginia. He would start an Indian war. He would claim Pittsburgh for Virginia and take it away from Pennsylvania and rename Pittsburgh Fort Dunmore. Then the revolution outbreaks in 75, and he races back to the coast because he was inland, and he freed the slaves to fight for the British. He becomes a pirate. Most of the loyalists in Virginia end up on a flotilla, and during the same time, Lord Dunmore burns Norfolk. He bombs Norfolk from some ships. In 1779 was the famous Act of Attainder. Go back to the last one. The Act of Attainder. So New York State confiscated the estates of the Loyalists from the Revolutionary War, including Tryon, Dunmore, Reid, Kemp, and Governor Colden's son. Governor Colden had died by this time. And they were banished from the state. So when we compare the results that would end up happening of these egregious grants and these men being banished from the state, and we compare that with the quotes earlier about the Green Mountain Boys and their extra legal militia, I just think that time has sort of informed us that that extra legal militia was a very patriotic militia, and they were doing the right thing by pushing out those redcoats. So, next slide. So there's the Green Mountain Boys Cave at Lake Dunmore. I'm sure you guys know a little bit more about that than I do. We're just talking about frontiers of huts and caves and blockhouses and just a wild time between the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War. I made this is my second Green Mountain Boys tours brochure talking about Ann Story's Cave in West Salisbury. That's very near Dunmore. So not a very safe place for anybody to be in northern Vermont, anywhere near the Crown Point at this time. So this presentation brought us to understand the quote, "A Few Laws Vagabonds." So most of the monikers about the Green Mountain Boys came from the New York governors or from the British. Bennington Mob came from Cadwallader Colden. Green Mountain Boys also from Cadwallader Colden. A Few Lawless Vagabonds, I just explained that. And a gathering storm upon my left, Johnny Burgoyne. So once again, I'm just talking about some of the black eyes that the Green Mountain Boys and Ethan Allen had over time, and how a lot of the authors that have written about that have actually gotten some things wrong, and haven't used some of the primary sources correctly, and haven't mapped the location of these events correctly. And knowing that these events actually happened within Vermont, and not north of Albany, and not in New Perth or Salem, and not in Argyle Town, really makes a big difference. And so once again, that's my little reward poster. I like that a lot. I've never seen anybody do anything with that Ethan Allen reward poster. It's just, I've seen it just in a script form before. And I thank you guys for coming to the Crown Point Road Association's annual meeting. If anybody has any questions about the Scottish settlers, answer those now.
Focusing back on Lake Creek Meadow.
Yep.
And the Scottish there, how early do the Scottish arrive in that area?
I think we're talking about just 1771.
Okay.
I think I have some quotes, 70 or 71, so just right then. Right before they were pushed out.
And how did they get into there? From where?
What do you mean?
Well, they did. I guess what I'm trying to say is an example if they either come up from Bennington or Albany or.
Yeah, probably over from Albany or something. Yep, up from New York City.
Okay.
Yep. I'm not sure if some of these fellas don't know what they're getting themselves into. Hey, we got this contested border. You can rent this land for cheap. You know what I mean? So I think what we're looking at is some people that know where they're settling, and so maybe not as innocent as you might think. These guys settling on board, and I'm finding those sort of characteristics in Bennington and Shaftesbury, and it's also being insinuated up here. So, yes, Pat.
Yes. When did Haldeman make that statement of a few lawless vagabonds? Do you have the date?
I'm pretty sure that's 73.
73.
Yeah. So there was 2 requests for British redcoats that the New York governors made to have them march upon the Green Mountain Boys, and that was the second one.
Was he the provisional commander at that time?
It was because Gage. He was standing in for Gage. I can't remember exactly. Exactly. It was for the time that Gage was back in England. The first request was to Gage. Question?
Yeah, I was going to ask if, or what the reason was behind, you mentioned there was a fictitious company on one of the land titles?
Yeah, the McClure Company, which stands for Lord Dunmore's claims. So the king has sort of a limit for how much land you can claim. 2,000 acres, 500 acres for like a private, and a few more acres for, 2,000, 5,000, I think 10,000 was about as big of a land grant that the king was actually approving.
So it was just as a strategy to expand beyond that.
Yeah, so they're trying to deceive the king about the fraudulent land grants. And you'll see that in so many different ways on that Souvier Map. Different spellings of the same name, calling one guy a colonel and then calling the same guy a corporal in another spot, it's the same guy.
Whenever they were they ever called into question, they had to say, "Oh no, it's actually because it's real." They had to justify it, or it never was. It generally just overlooked.
I'm not quite sure what the question was.
Like, were those types of tactics generally overlooked, or were they called into question and they had to justify it?
The egregious land grants? Yeah, well, the king had ruled against that in 1767. Okay, so that's why the Green Mountain Boys are really just considering any grant after 67 void. And they're just kicking you out, period. So grants before 67, I think they might have a slightly different tactic for the people who had New York grants before 67. Yeah.
Well, I think you had an idea, you mentioned once, where Ethan Allen was on July 19th, 1771.
Where he was?
Yeah.
Just up north. I think I have a note somewhere on that one.
You told me Poultney.
Did I?
Yeah.
Did I tell you that before?
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, I can't remember that right now. So, as somebody who wants to introduce, this poorly known history to people, I'm somebody who wants to take things chronologically. So the Breckenridge Standoff and the birthplace of Vermont would be a great place for us to start, and that's where we did start. And then this next thing with the Scottish settlers is sort of overlapping that, and then taking it the next couple of years. Yeah, this is a good point.
Can I ask one more?
Yeah.
What got you interested in this? What drew you to this?
This particular part?
Yeah, in general.
Well, this research came as I finished up with all my Breckenridge research. I wondered what was next, and I knew what was next. It was that terrible stuff that Ethan Allen had done to those settlers, New York settlers in Rupert. He burned their fine houses, and I knew there had to be something besides that. And there had to be something, I noticed that there was something wrong with those tales. So I finally got around to correcting some history. Start.
You mentioned a couple of times about Green Mountain Boys showing the beach seal.
Yeah.
For those that don't know what that is, could you explain what that is specifically?
I did. I went right around that. So the beach seal happens, the twigs of the wilderness has to do with whipping people. And usually the people they would whip would be people they'd already warned. So they would warn somebody first, okay? Usually, so it's going to be a constable. So a constable, he takes a job with New York, and he's warned first. If you do X, Y, and Z, as your constable or a magistrate, you're going to end up getting, 100 lashes from the Green Mountain Boys. So in my research, I found out that they're not necessarily just showing up and doing the beach seal. It's usually somebody who's been warned before as a punishment. But to compare and contrast that with New York, in New York City, they had a public whipper. So you would get 50 lashes, and they would put you in the back of a car, and they would take you around to all the various public squares in New York City and whip you a little bit in each one of those squares. So, it's not like the New Yorkers had any problems with corporal punishment. Yes?
The border between Vermont and Washington County
Yes.
runs right up through basically the mountain.
Yes.
Now, on Hebron, there's a West Hebron, and there's a North Hebron, and that is all well into the New York area, and it's just populated with Scotsmen. You've got the Gettys, you've got the Campbells, you've got the Reids. There's a whole family of Reids that are in Greenwich. They're actually to the east of Greenwich.
Wow.
And, it's spelled the same.
Yep.
And that area of West Hebron has got one of the most magnificent Presbyterian churches in eastern New York.
The Scots were Presbyterians.
What I'm curious about is who finally delineated that line that runs basically from Rensselaer County and White Creek all the way up to Fort Champlain, yeah, on the edge of Champlain. So how did they ever come to an accommodation on where the line is?
That's a very good question. I don't think they settled the border until after the Revolution, so I think we can know when they specifically settled that Vermont, New York border. But just keep in mind that all these guys are, in this era, people are surveyors, people are land claimants, so they have a pretty good idea of where these borders are. And that's been something that I've been interested in. So I think they know pretty much where the border is. And so what the Vermonters are doing is trying to establish a 20-mile line from the Hudson, and that's a 20-mile line that they're establishing, Bennington being 20 miles from the Hudson River. The rest of it is just a straight line north and south from that.
Just another note.
Yep.
A lot of the surveys that are done within Washington County and Rensselaer County are all based on Dutch patents. And the Dutch patents are noted in deeds that go pre-Revolutionary War. So, it'd be interesting to know if maybe that line, because it's a straight line right up along Washington County, there's a few jigs and jacks, right up to Skeens. Be curious to see the research on it.
Yeah, well, I love your comments about the Scottish settlers that still exist around here. So, yeah, living history indeed. Any other questions? Well, I thank you very much for coming here today.
Thank you very much. That's certainly done your homework, and it's great to learn these details. So that concludes our annual meeting. We'll see you next year, we hope. Safe home.
Most of